Your great-grandmother could butcher a chicken before sunrise. She could preserve meat for 6 months without a refrigerator, start a fire in the rain, navigate by starlight, deliver a baby, sew a coat from scratch. And she did all of this while raising 6 kids in a house with no running water. You called your landlord last week because you couldn't figure out how to reset a circuit breaker. This isn't an insult, it's a diagnosis. Somewhere between the greatest generation and whatever we're calling ourselves now, we outsourced our survival to systems. Electric grids, supply chains, Google. The magical glowing rectangle in your pocket that answers every question except the ones that matter when the lights go out. And those systems work great, until they don't. Here's a number that should terrify you. In 1900, the average American could perform roughly 30 to 40 distinct survival skills as a matter of daily life. These weren't survival skills. They were just called Tuesday. By 2024, studies suggest most adults can't confidently perform more than 5. We didn't get dumber, we got dependent. And when the grid goes down, and if you've been paying attention, you know the if is really a when. Your great-grandmother would outlast you. Not because she was tougher, not because she was smarter, because she knew things you've been allowed to forget. Here's the darkest part of this whole equation. You probably can't even make a list of what you don't know. The skills are so thoroughly lost that you don't know they exist. You don't know what you're missing until you're freezing, starving, and dying of dysentery because you drank water that looked clean. Rule number 1 of the world that's coming. Your ancestors weren't preppers. They were just competent adults living in a world that demanded competence. And that world is about to make a comeback. Let's fix what's broken. The great forgetting. How we became helpless. Before we get into what you don't know, let's talk about why you don't know it. Because this wasn't an accident. This was a trade, and you got screwed. Picture America in 1900. 40% of the population lives on farms. Skills aren't hobbies. They're not weekend projects for bored suburbanites. They're the difference between eating and starving, between warmth and hypothermia, between your children living and your children dying. A kid learns to start a fire by age 8, not because it's a fun activity, because if they can't, they're useless. And useless people don't survive winters. Then comes the transition, 1940 to 1970. The post-war boom brings washing machines, refrigerators, processed food, suburban living. Suddenly, for the first time in human history, these skills become optional. And here's where the chain breaks. Parents who grew up during the Depression, who know exactly how to preserve food and repair clothes and start fires in the rain, look at their children and think, we worked hard so they wouldn't have to. Noble intention, catastrophic result. By 1970, microwave ovens are becoming standard. Fast food is everywhere. Clothes are disposable. The phrase, why learn to sew when clothes are cheap, enters the cultural vocabulary. Home economics gets cut from school curricula. Shop class follows. And then comes the final nail. The smartphone. The magic rectangle that creates the most dangerous illusion in human history. The illusion of knowledge. I could learn that if I needed to. No, you couldn't. Because learning takes time you won't have. Learning takes practice you haven't done. Learning takes tools you don't own and materials you can't find when everyone else is looking for them too. The comfortable lie of the modern age is that information equals capability. It doesn't. Watching a YouTube video about starting a fire is not the same as starting a fire. And when you're hypothermic and your hands are shaking and the wood is wet and there's no algorithm to save you, that distinction becomes very, very clear. Here's the math of modern dependency. Trace your morning coffee. Electricity to brew it, natural gas or electricity to heat the water, municipal water system to fill the pot, global supply chain to import the beans, container ships crossing oceans, oil and fuel systems to power those ships, banking systems to enable transactions, communication networks to coordinate all of it. One weak link anywhere in that chain, no coffee. Now apply that analysis to everything you consume, everything you rely on. You'll find the same fragile web everywhere. Your grandparents' coffee? Stored beans, hand grinder, fire, well water. 2 dependencies, their own labor and their own supplies. We traded resilience for efficiency. We got a fantastic deal. right up until the moment the deal falls apart. Fire, the skill that separates the living from the freezing. So you've got a lighter. Congratulations. You've got a single point of failure with a limited fuel supply and a mechanism that breaks when wet. Your great-grandfather could make fire from friction, from sparks off rocks, from sunlight focused through ice. He could do it in the rain, in the snow, in conditions that would have you crying into your useless Bic lighter. Here's a statistic that should keep you up at night. 83% of American adults have never started a fire without matches or a lighter. Of those who tried, 94% failed within 30 minutes. You know what happens in 30 minutes of failed fire attempts when it's below freezing? Hypothermia starts setting in. Your manual dexterity drops, your thinking gets fuzzy, and your chances of ever getting that fire started drop with your core temperature. Fire isn't just one skill. Fire is the master skill. It enables everything else. Water purification? You need to boil it. Cooking food? Fire. Staying warm? Fire. Signaling for rescue? 3 fires in a triangle. Psychological stability in a survival situation? Nothing maintains morale like a fire. Your ancestors understood that fire was the foundation of survival. They built entire civilizations around controlling it. And you can't make it without a gas station lighter. The science isn't complicated. Fire needs 3 things: heat, fuel, and oxygen. The friction methods, bow drill, hand drill, work by generating heat through rapid movement. The cellular structure of dry wood breaks down around 572 degrees Fahrenheit. Get it hot enough, add oxygen, you've got ignition. The problem is generating that heat without modern tools. It's not impossible. It's not even particularly complicated in principle, but it requires practice. Lots of practice. The kind of practice you should have been doing for years and probably haven't. Start with a ferro rod. That's a modern fire steel. Scrape it with a hard edge, it throws sparks hot enough to ignite tinder. It's the bridge between modern convenience and actual skill. Learn to get consistent ignition in under 60 seconds. Then work backward toward more primitive methods. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. That lighter in your pocket will run out. The matches will get wet. The ferro rod will eventually wear down. And the ability to create fire from nothing but wood and determination? That never runs out. Well, unless you run out. Which brings us to your next problem, food preservation, because refrigerators are just expensive boxes without electricity. Open your refrigerator, look at what's inside. Now imagine the power's been out for 48 hours. Everything in there is either dangerous or disgusting. Probably both. The average American household has 3 days of food. The average refrigerator keeps that food safe for 4 to 6 hours without power. Your entire food security, everything standing between you and hunger, rests on an unbroken electrical grid and a 72-hour resupply chain. Your great-grandmother would find this hilarious. In a grim, how did humanity fall so far kind of way. Before refrigeration became standard in the 1950s, food preservation wasn't a hobby. It was the only reason anyone survived winter. You preserved food in September or you starved in February. Simple math, brutal consequences. Smoking, salting, drying, canning, fermenting, root cellaring. These weren't options on a lifestyle blog. They were the technologies that kept humanity alive for thousands of years before some genius figured out how to make a box cold. Here's how smoking works. You hang meat in a controlled smoke environment for days or weeks. Cold smoking stays below 90 degrees Fahrenheit. That's for long-term preservation. Hot smoking cooks and preserves simultaneously. The compounds in wood smoke are antimicrobial. They kill the bacteria that would otherwise turn your deer into a biohazard. Salt curing is even simpler. Salt draws moisture out of meat through osmosis. Bacteria need moisture to survive. No moisture, no bacteria. A properly salted ham can last a year at room temperature. Your great-grandmother had hams hanging in her cellar that were older than some of your relationships. Canning uses heat to sterilize food and create an airtight seal. The key is understanding which foods need pressure canning, that's your meats and low-acid vegetables, versus water bath canning for high-acid foods like pickles and tomatoes. Get this wrong, and you're playing Russian roulette with botulism, which is a particularly unpleasant way to discover you should have paid more attention. Fermentation turns food's own bacteria against the bad bacteria. Sauerkraut, kimchi, pickles, These aren't just foods, they're preservation technologies. The beneficial bacteria produce acid, and that acid environment prevents the growth of pathogens. Your great-grandmother had a crock of fermenting cabbage in her kitchen. You have a subscription to a meal delivery service. The survival application is brutally simple. When the grid goes down, your refrigerated food has a 2-day window before it becomes a health hazard. After that, you're dependent on whatever non-perishables you stockpiled. But stockpiles run out. Hunting and foraging produce perishable food. Without preservation skills, you're trapped in a constant cycle of acquisition and immediate consumption. Exactly the pattern that leads to starvation when acquisition becomes difficult. One successful deer hunt, properly preserved, becomes a month of protein. One successful deer hunt without preservation skills becomes 3 days of eating, followed by 200 pounds of rotting meat and a valuable lesson about your own incompetence. Start with water bath canning. It's the easiest, lowest risk entry point. Pickles, tomatoes, fruit preserves. The equipment costs less than a nice dinner out. The skills could keep you alive when nice dinners out are a distant memory. Water, the thing that'll kill you faster than starvation. You can survive 3 weeks without food. You can survive 3 days without water. Adjust your priorities accordingly. 76% of Americans cannot identify a natural water source within 5 miles of their home. Think about that. 3/4 of the population couldn't find water if the tap stopped flowing and their lives depended on it. Their lives would depend on it. That's the point. Your great-grandfather knew every spring, creek, and pond within a day's walk of his home. He knew which ones ran year-round and which dried up in summer. He knew which ones were upstream of contamination sources and which ones would give you dysentery. This wasn't specialized knowledge. This was knowing your environment well enough to survive in it. Here's what modern water dependence looks like. Turn the tap, water comes out. Magic. Invisible infrastructure. Pumping stations and treatment plants and thousands of miles of pipes, all maintained by people you'll never meet, all powered by electricity you take for granted. Average American uses 80 to 100 gallons per day. Average American stores less than 3 gallons for emergencies. When the taps stop, most people have about a day before they're in serious trouble, and about 3 days before they're in mortal danger. The science of water purification is straightforward. Pathogens, bacteria, viruses, parasites, are killed by heat. A rolling boil for 1 to 3 minutes destroys virtually everything that wants to destroy you. At higher altitudes, you need more time because water boils at lower temperatures. But you can't boil water you can't find. Which brings us back to the fundamental problem. This week, walk your area. Every creek, pond, stream, retention basin within 5 miles. Mark them on a physical map, not just your phone. Assess each one: size, flow rate, likely contamination sources, accessibility during different conditions. This is basic reconnaissance that our ancestors did automatically and that you've probably never done once. Your great-grandmother knew where the water was. She knew how to make it safe. She could survive a drought that would kill you in 72 hours. And she didn't even think of it as a skill. She thought of it as paying attention. Sewing, the lost art of not throwing everything away. Here's a fun fact: 74% of Americans cannot sew a button. A button! The most basic clothing repair task that exists. Thread through holes, tie a knot. Apparently, this is beyond the capabilities of 3/4 of the adult population. Your great-grandmother made clothes from scratch, not from a pattern she bought at a store, from fabric she wove, patterns she drafted, designs she invented based on need. She could look at a garment, understand how it was constructed, and replicate it. She kept every scrap of usable fabric because she knew its value. You throw away 70 pounds of textiles per year because a button fell off. Clothing is shelter. In hostile environments, and trust me, all environments become hostile when the systems fail, damaged clothing means exposure. A torn jacket in winter isn't an inconvenience, it's a survival problem. The economics made this inevitable, of course. When a new shirt costs less than lunch, repair makes no financial sense. Global supply chains and overseas manufacturing turned clothing into disposable goods. Why spend an hour fixing something you can replace for $12? The answer becomes obvious when there are no more $12 shirts. When the supply chain is broken and the stores are empty, and what you're wearing is what you've got, potentially for years. Then that button matters. That torn seam matters. The ability to patch, mend, and maintain becomes the difference between being clothed and being vulnerable. Beyond repair, there's construction. Basic sewing knowledge means you can create from raw materials. Canvas becomes bags. Fabric scraps become bandages, patches, weatherproofing. Leather becomes sheaths, straps, repairs. Without sewing skills, you can't even improvise. Start this week. Not metaphorically. Actually sew a button onto something. Remove one from a shirt you don't care about, then reattach it. This takes 10 minutes and teaches you the basic mechanics of needle and thread manipulation. Then patch something. Find a worn garment, cut a piece of fabric from something else, attach it. Learn the running stitch, the back stitch, the whip stitch. These aren't complicated. A 10-year-old could learn them in an afternoon. Your great-grandmother did. The fact that this feels like a revelation rather than common sense is all the evidence you need of how far we've fallen. Navigation. Because GPS is just a satellite away from useless. Quick question. If your phone died right now and you needed to get home from somewhere unfamiliar, could you do it? If you hesitated, you have a problem. 67% of Americans under 40 cannot read a paper map confidently. 78% have never used a compass. A generation has grown up following the blue line, and when the blue line disappears, so does their ability to find their way. GPS dependency creates a terrifying cognitive gap. The technology handles navigation so completely that users never build mental maps. After 50 trips to the same location, most GPS-dependent drivers still couldn't get there without electronic assistance. The knowledge simply never forms because it's never needed, until it is needed, and then it's too late to acquire. Your great-grandfather could navigate by sun position, star patterns, terrain features, vegetation, wind direction. He could look at a landscape and understand which way was north, which way led to water, which way led to civilization. This wasn't a special talent. This was basic environmental awareness that humans developed over hundreds of thousands of years of evolution and abandoned in about 20 years of smartphone adoption. The North Star has guided travelers for millennia. It sits at the end of the Little Dipper's handle, almost exactly aligned with true north in the Northern Hemisphere. Tonight, if the sky is clear, go outside and find it. This simple act, locating a fixed navigational reference, was something every human knew how to do until your generation. The sun rises in the east, sets in the west. At its highest point in the Northern Hemisphere, it indicates south. Your shadow at noon points north. These aren't survival tricks. These are basic facts about the planet you live on that most people have never bothered to notice because their phone tells them which way to turn. Maps and compass work together. The compass tells you direction. The map tells you what's in each direction. Triangulation, taking bearings to 2 or more known landmarks, tells you where you are. This isn't difficult. Boy Scouts learned it at age 12. But it requires practice, and practice requires caring enough to try. Get a compass this week. Learn to take a bearing. Get a topographic map of your area and learn to read contour lines. Practice orienting the map to reality. These are the building blocks of never being lost again. Because when the satellites go dark, and they can, through solar events, cyber attacks, or simply running out of battery at the worst possible moment, you'll either know where you are or you won't. And lost in a crisis isn't an inconvenience. It's an emergency. Cooking, beyond the microwave instructions. 28% of Americans can't cook without a recipe. 19% don't cook at all, ever. Let that sink in. Nearly 1 in 5 adults has completely outsourced the most basic survival function, converting raw materials into food to restaurants, delivery services, and frozen dinner manufacturers. Your great-grandmother could look at a pantry full of raw ingredients and produce a meal. Not because she was a culinary genius, but because that's what cooking meant before cooking became following instructions on a box. Modern cooking is a simulacrum. Recipe on phone, pre-prepped ingredients from the store, electric appliances that handle the hard parts. Remove any single element from that equation. No recipe, raw ingredients, no power, and most people are helpless. The real skill isn't following instructions, it's understanding principles. Heat denatures proteins. That's why meat changes color and texture when cooked. Maillard reaction creates browning and flavor. That's the chemistry happening when you sear meat or toast bread. Starch gelatinization is what makes bread rise and pasta soften. Understanding the why lets you adapt the how. Fire cooking requires heat management that modern appliances handle automatically. You don't turn a dial. You move food closer or farther from the coals. Use different heat zones. Understand the difference between cooking over flames versus cooking over embers. The flames look impressive. The embers do the work. Flames char the outside before the inside cooks. Embers provide steady, controllable heat that cooks evenly. Your great-grandmother knew this intuitively. You're probably still burning things on your backyard grill. Bread is the test case. Flour, water, salt, yeast. 4 ingredients. The foundation of human nutrition for 10,000 years. The simplest staple food that exists. And most modern adults have never made it. Couldn't make it if their lives depended on it. Making bread teaches you about yeast, a living organism that produces carbon dioxide when fed sugars, creating the bubbles that make bread rise. It teaches you about gluten development, the protein network created by kneading that gives bread structure. It teaches you about temperature. Too hot kills the yeast, too cold slows it down. Make bread this week, from flour, water, yeast, salt. Not from a box, not from a mix, from the actual ingredients that humans have used for millennia. Fail. Try again. Learn from your failures. Because when the power goes out and the delivery apps stop working and the grocery store is empty, the ability to transform raw ingredients into food using nothing but fire and knowledge becomes the ability to survive. First aid, because 911 isn't always coming. Average ambulance response time, 7 to 14 minutes. In rural areas, 30 minutes or more. In a major disaster, when everyone needs help simultaneously, hours, days, never. That's not pessimism, that's the math of overwhelmed systems. Only 30% of Americans have any first aid training. Less than 5% could set a basic splint. The default response to any medical situation has become, call someone who knows what they're doing, which works great until no one comes. Your great-grandmother was the someone who knew what they were doing. Doctors were expensive, distant, and frequently unavailable. Antibiotics didn't exist until the 1940s. Every household had someone who could handle basic medical situations, not because they wanted to, but because the alternative was watching people suffer and die from treatable conditions. Wound care is the foundation. Clean the wound, control the bleeding, prevent infection, protect while healing. These 4 steps handle the majority of trauma situations. Your great-grandmother did this with boiled cloth, honey, and herbs. You can do it with modern supplies, if you have them and know how to use them. Bleeding control matters more than most people realize. A severed femoral artery can cause death in 3 minutes. A bad cut can lead to shock in 15. Pressure controls bleeding. Pressure points reduce flow to extremities. Tourniquets are last resorts for limbs, but knowing when and how to apply them saves lives. The herbal medicine your ancestors knew wasn't superstition. It was ethnobotany, the accumulated knowledge of plant properties developed over thousands of years. Willow bark contains salicin, the compound that aspirin is derived from. Honey has antimicrobial properties. Yarrow helps stop bleeding. These plants still grow all around you. Your ancestors knew which ones helped. You walk past them without a second glance. This doesn't mean abandoning modern medicine. It means having options when modern medicine isn't available. Knowing 5 medicinal plants in your region, really knowing them, not just having read about them once, gives you capabilities most people lack entirely. Take a first aid course, build a kit, and learn what everything in it does. Not just own it, understand it. Practice applying pressure bandages, practice splinting, practice assessing injured people. The skills are perishable, they fade without reinforcement, but they're also acquirable. You can learn this. Your great-grandmother knew how to keep people alive until their bodies healed. You know how to dial 3 numbers and hope someone answers. One of those approaches still works when the phones don't. Laundry, the surprisingly critical task you've never done by hand. Dirty clothes don't seem like a survival issue until they become one. Bacteria breed in soiled fabric. Fungi colonize damp material. Parasites nest in unwashed clothing. What starts as discomfort becomes skin infection, becomes systemic illness, becomes a serious medical problem, in an environment where medical help might not be coming. Your great-grandmother spent an entire day each week doing laundry. Wash day was a recognized event requiring hours of physical labor. Heating water over fire, scrubbing fabric against washboards, wringing out heavy wet cloth, hanging everything to dry. It was exhausting, time-consuming work that absolutely no one misses. But she knew how. When the washing machine isn't an option, power outage, mechanical failure, societal disruption, she could still have clean clothes. Can you? The process isn't complicated. Hot water, soap, agitation, rinse, wring, dry. The washing machine automates these steps. Removing the machine just means doing them manually. Soap works through surfactants, molecules with one end attracted to water and one end attracted to oil and grease. The agitation breaks soil loose, the surfactants surround the particles and suspend them in water, rinsing carries them away. This chemistry doesn't require electricity. It requires understanding. A washboard provides friction surface for scrubbing. The ridged surface increases agitation when you rub fabric across it, breaking loose dirt more effectively than hand rubbing alone. They cost about $20 and work indefinitely. Wringing removes excess water so clothes dry faster. The hand-cranked wringer your great-grandmother used was a significant labor saver, 2 rollers squeezing water out of fabric. You can approximate this by twisting, but it's harder work for worse results. Here's what most people don't know. Hand-washed clothes, done properly, come out cleaner than machine-washed clothes. The individual attention to stains and heavy soil areas, the ability to adjust technique for different fabrics, machines can't match that. What machines can match is convenience. Hours of labor reduced to pressing a button. That trade made sense when buttons were always available. It makes less sense when they're not. Wash something by hand this week. Actually do it. A small load in a tub with real scrubbing and real wringing. Notice how physical it is. Notice what actually gets clothes clean. File that knowledge away for when you need it. Animal husbandry, where food actually comes from. A study found that over 30% of British children didn't know eggs came from chickens. American data is similar. We've created a civilization where a significant portion of the population doesn't understand the basic origin of food. Meat comes from plastic packages. Eggs come from cartons. The animals are invisible, industrial, somewhere else. Your great-grandmother kept chickens in her backyard. Not because she was a farmer, because that's how you had eggs. Reliable, renewable protein that required nothing but scraps, bugs, and basic care. 6 hens produce approximately 4 to 5 eggs daily during laying season. That's sustainable protein for a small family indefinitely from animals that eat kitchen scraps and weeds. Compare that to stockpiled food, which runs out, or hunting, which is inconsistent, or foraging, which provides limited protein. The renewable nature of livestock is the key advantage. Animals reproduce, plants regrow. These are sustainable food sources. Cans and packages are finite. Long-term survival requires production, not just consumption. Backyard chickens were standard in America until surprisingly recently. Zoning laws, suburban development, and industrial agriculture combined to eliminate them from most areas. But the laws are changing in many places. Urban chicken keeping is legal in more municipalities than most people realize. The basics aren't complicated. Shelter them from predators. This is critical, as one fox or raccoon can eliminate an entire flock overnight. Feed them appropriately. Commercial feed supplemented with scraps works fine. Collect eggs daily. Watch for signs of illness. That's the foundation. The uncomfortable part is processing. If you're keeping chickens only for eggs, you can avoid this. But if you're keeping them for meat, or if you have aging hens that no longer lay, you need to know how to kill, pluck, and butcher them. This was normal knowledge for all of human history. Your great-grandmother did it without a second thought. This skill requires more investment than the others: space, legal permission, ongoing commitment. Start by checking whether it's even allowed where you live. If it is, visit someone who keeps chickens. Learn what's actually involved before committing. This isn't a casual hobby you pick up in an afternoon, but understanding that your food comes from living things, that someone has to raise and care for and ultimately process those things, that the plastic-wrapped packages in the store represent systems that could fail. That understanding matters. Even if you never keep a chicken yourself. Tools. Because everything requires something. 45% of millennials could not name the functions of basic tools like a wrench, screwdriver, and hammer. 76% have never sharpened any cutting tool. We've raised a generation that cannot use the fundamental implements of civilization. The things that build shelter, process materials, create and repair everything we need. They're mysteries, black boxes to be avoided or hired out. Your great-grandfather could sharpen an axe, replace a handle, maintain every tool he owned, and fix most things that broke around his property. Not because he was particularly skilled, because that's what competent adults did. A man who couldn't maintain his tools wasn't considered fully functional. The economics, again, made this inevitable. Power tools are cheap. Professional services are available. Disposable products mean nothing needs repairing because replacement costs less than repair. Why spend an hour fixing something when you can buy a new one for $20? The answer appears when there are no more $20 replacements. When supply chains break and stores close, and what you have is what you have. Then, the ability to maintain, repair, and improvise becomes essential. Sharpening is the gateway skill. Every cutting tool, knives, axes, chisels, saws, requires periodic sharpening. Dull tools are dangerous. They slip instead of cutting, leading to injuries, and ineffective. They require more force and do worse work. Your great-grandfather spent time every week maintaining edges. The principle is simple. You remove material from the edge at a consistent angle until you create a new, sharp edge. Whetstones for knives, files for axes. The specific technique varies by tool, but the concept is universal. Get a knife. Get a basic whetstone. Learn to maintain an edge. This takes maybe an hour to learn adequately, and maybe 10 hours to get genuinely good at. The skill transfers to every cutting tool you'll ever use. Beyond sharpening, there's repair. Handles break, mechanisms wear, things fall apart. The repair mindset, examining a broken object, understanding how it works, figuring out how to fix it, was the default mode for all of human history. It only became unusual in the last few decades. Look at the tools you own. Do you know how to maintain them? Could you repair them if they broke? Could you use them effectively for their intended purpose? If not, start learning. Because when just buy a new one stops being an option, fix what you have becomes the only option. The uncomfortable math of your incompetence. Let's add this up. A baseline competent adult in 1950 could start fire without matches if needed, preserve food multiple ways, find and purify water, repair their own clothing, navigate with map and compass, cook from raw ingredients over fire, treat basic injuries and illnesses, wash clothes without machines, keep small livestock or know-how, use and maintain hand tools. That's just the 10 skills in this video. The actual list was longer, much longer. These weren't considered achievements. They weren't resume items. They were minimum requirements for being a functional human being. How many can you do? Be honest. Not, I could probably figure it out. Not, I've seen videos about that. Actually do, right now, if your life depended on it. For most people, the answer is somewhere between 1 and 3, and most of those partially. This is the gap. This is the vulnerability. This is what happens when 3 generations outsource survival to systems and services. Here's the lie you've been telling yourself. I'll learn when I need to. You won't. Because learning takes time you won't have. Your first bow drill fire requires 50+ failed attempts. Your first canned food might give you botulism if you don't understand the science. Your first navigation attempt when you're actually lost might take you further from safety, not closer. Skills require practice. Practice requires time. Time is the resource you don't have once the crisis starts. The other lie? I'll just Google it. Google requires electricity. Internet requires infrastructure. Your phone requires battery power. When all 3 fail simultaneously, and they can, and they will eventually, you're left with the knowledge in your head and the skills in your hands. That's it. That's all you have. The dependency web. How fragile your life actually is. The electrical grid is the master dependency. Almost everything requires electricity, either directly or somewhere in the supply chain. Grid failure isn't science fiction. The Carrington event of 1859, a solar storm, would destroy modern electronics if it happened today. Scientists estimate a 1 to 2% chance per decade. That's not probably won't happen in your lifetime. That's probably will happen eventually. Cyberattacks on grid infrastructure are constant. The 2003 Northeast blackout took out power for 55 million people because of software bugs and human error. The grid isn't robust. It's held together with duct tape and hope. When the grid fails, everything else follows. Municipal water requires pumping stations. Pumping stations require electricity. The gas pumps at your local station require electricity. The refrigeration at your grocery store requires electricity. The traffic lights, the payment systems, the supply chain logistics, all electricity dependent. FEMA recommends 72 hours of supplies. That's the official assumption. Systems will be restored or help will arrive within 3 days. What happens when that assumption is wrong? Hurricane Katrina. Some areas waited 5+ days for help. Puerto Rico after Maria, months without power. The assumption breaks down when the disaster is large enough. And when it does, you discover exactly what you're capable of. 3 days of food, 1 day of water, 0 ability to get more of either. 0 ability to purify water you find. 0 ability to preserve food you somehow acquire. 0 ability to cook it without electricity. 0 ability to navigate to somewhere better. 0 ability to fix anything that breaks. That's the profile of the average American adult in a grid-down scenario. That's the profile of someone who doesn't survive. The chain that broke. Why your parents didn't teach you. This wasn't malice. It wasn't neglect. It was aspiration twisted into catastrophe. The greatest generation, born 1901 to 1927, knew the skills. They lived through the Depression, through scarcity, through genuine hardship. Competence was survival. Their children, the baby boomers, learned some skills but watched them become obsolete. Convenience was arriving. The old ways seemed unnecessary. And so they made a choice that felt like love. We worked hard so you wouldn't have to. They succeeded. The generations that followed work less hard physically than any generation in human history. Manual labor is optional. Practical skills are hobbies. The struggle their grandparents faced has been engineered away. They didn't anticipate that easier might mean helpless. The chain of knowledge transfer broke. Skills pass through generations, parents teaching children, grandparents reinforcing, communities maintaining. When one generation decides not to teach because the skills seem obsolete, the next generation doesn't know what they're missing. And the generation after that doesn't even know the skills exist. Home economics disappeared from schools. Shop class followed. The assumption was that students would buy services for practical tasks. No need to learn when you can hire. The rebranding tells the story. What we now call survival skills or homesteading skills used to be called being an adult. The fact that there's a prepper movement at all means that basic competence has become a specialized interest. The irony is complete. Skills that were once baseline requirements for adulthood are now fringe hobbies. And the people who practice them are viewed as eccentrics. Until the systems fail. Then they're called survivors. Rebuilding your link. What to do starting now. This isn't about becoming a wilderness expert by next Tuesday. It's about starting. It's about recognizing that the chain broke and deciding to rebuild your link. Priority 1. Fire, water, first aid. These are immediate survival needs. Learn them first, practice them regularly. This week, try to start a fire with something other than a lighter. Walk your neighborhood and identify water sources. Build a proper first aid kit and learn what everything in it does. This month, reach out to someone older who might know these skills. Ask them to teach you one thing, just one. You might be surprised. Most older people who have this knowledge are desperate to pass it on. They just need someone willing to learn. This year, pick 3 skills and get genuinely competent. Not expert, competent. That means you can do them reliably, under suboptimal conditions, without looking anything up. 3 skills puts you ahead of 90% of the population. The knowledge exists. The skills can be learned. People are willing to teach. The resources, books, videos, courses, communities, are more available than they've ever been. What's missing is your decision to start. The final calculation. Your great-grandmother wasn't a survivalist. She wasn't a prepper. She wasn't part of any movement or philosophy. She was just a competent human being living in a world that required competence. She knew things because not knowing them meant suffering, hardship, possibly death. She learned because learning was the only option. You have a choice she didn't have. You can remain dependent, comfortable, convenient, helpless. Or you can learn, harder, slower, genuinely capable. The systems that enable your dependence will work until they don't. History says they'll eventually fail. Physics says they're fragile. Current events suggest eventually might be sooner than comfortable. When that happens, you'll be exactly as capable as you've made yourself. Not as capable as you could theoretically become. Not as capable as the YouTube videos you've watched. As capable as the skills you've actually developed. Your great-grandmother would look at you and wonder how humanity fell so far. How the species that conquered continents and built civilizations produced a generation that can't sew a button, or start a fire, or find water, or preserve food. But she'd also recognize that you can learn. That the capacity for these skills lives in your hands and your brain, dormant but present. That what was lost can be found again if you decide to look. The chain broke. You can rebuild your link. Or you can hope the systems hold forever. Your choice. Just don't take too long to make it.